Good evening, everyone. Welcome here. Thank you for being here for another inner hour with us. I appreciate it. Just invite you to take a moment wherever you are and pause and let go of whatever you may be preoccupied with or still occupied with from the day, and just come present and relax for the next hour to focus here with us. And I'm doing the same. As you know, I like to light a candle at the beginning of this, so here I am lighting the candle. Maybe. So that's my little candle, or a tall candle. We're continuing in the Great Souls theme tonight, and we have a lot of them I'd like to touch on in the series, just to, again, to kind of give you a brief intro to them if you may not be familiar with them, or maybe remind you if you do know a bit about them, maybe spark your interest to study more, learn a little more about them. Before I do that, though, I have an announcement. Most of you know this already, but I want to mention it just in case. So the collection of the Moments of Grace articles that I wrote weekly between 2020 and 2024, I'm still writing them, but at some point I had to stop to collect them into a book. So I stopped. I did 4 years worth, and it's been out on Kindle for a while. It finally is actually out on Amazon in paperback form that you can order and get an actual book in your hands. So 4 years of articles looks like that. So it's called Moments of Grace, and it looks like this. It has kind of a picture of a gazebo. This is actually an inlet from a really pretty lake. Then on the back it has my little mug and a few comments about me and a few comments from people who've read it already. So that's available on Amazon if you're interested in having a copy. Please get one. If you get a copy, for those of you who may have already noticed it or plan to get a copy, if you do get a copy, I would really appreciate it after you look at it if you would put up a review on Amazon. Not send it to me. Several of you did that already, which are included in the book. Thank you for those. But to review it on Amazon, and you can use the same thing you sent me if you like, or you can create a totally new one. But having reviews on Amazon, especially positive ones, hopefully at least some of them will be positive. Having reviews on Amazon um, tweaks their algorithms so that when you search for me or when you search for a book, there are many books of that title. When you search for it, it will begin to slowly move it up so that it will be more visible in search engines on Amazon as opposed to being buried somewhere down like 28,312. It'll scooch it up somewhere and make it a little more visible, which would be nice for people who want to find it and nice for me. So if you read the book and like it, and you can take a few minutes to post an Amazon review, I'd sure appreciate it. Okay, so enough on that. Ani, before I get into the rest of the class tonight, if you're still listening on, do you have any announcements that we need to make that I'm likely to forget tonight? Upcoming things or whatever it might be?
I- I'm thinking, well, for local people or anybody who wants to fly in, there's the Reflections class.
Oh, right, sure, in May, you mean the first Saturday, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Michael and I, my friend Michael Patterson, most of you, all of you probably here know him. Um, he's a longtime musician in Fort Wayne. He's about my age, and he's also a longtime spiritual student. And he and I teach a monthly class on Saturday mornings from 10 to 11:30. This particular series we're doing right now, we've been doing it a few years, is a Bible study series basically. And then what we do is we send out an email to everyone locally in the group about what we're going to be studying the following. We send out about 2 weeks ahead of time, actually, in hopes that people will read the texts we're going to be discussing and think about them and come up with some of their own insights and questions and so on, so that we can not just have Michael and I only being the ones kind of teaching or talking, but that other people will be engaged as well. So you're welcome to that. If that's the first Saturday of the month. I don't know the date, but it's always the first Saturday of the month. So And then we're doing another gathering at some point in May. Is that right, Ani, or not?
That would be the 30th, I think.
It's toward the end, I
Yeah, the
know that.
last Saturday, which is the 30th, 30.
30th. Okay. So we'll tell you more. We'll send out information about that
Yeah,
again
that
to the local group. So
the 24th, the calendar for May goes out.
there you go. 24th of April, you mean?
Yes,
Yeah.
24th of April, the May calendar will go
Okay.
out.
All right. Perfect. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. Um, and I'm going to mention something that Ani doesn't know, but I just want to let you people, all of you people know, since everybody here does anyway. Uh, Ani had her birthday 2 days ago, which we got to celebrate with a big surprise with a bunch of her family. So it was really lovely. So she officially is 70, so I'm officially considering her an old person now. Um, actually, true.
With all attendant benefits of being an old person.
That's right. Uh, and realistically, truthfully, that is, I actually consider her an elder now, as opposed to just being old. Elders are people that I consider are not only chronologically old, but have attained some wisdom in the course of that chronology. And
So when I tell people what to do, I'm not being bossy anymore, I'm being wise.
oh, yeah, I of course forgot
That's
about
one
that
of the
part.
benefits of being old now.
Yeah, that there you go. There you
I
go.
like that.
But
Mhm.
since I'm older, I don't have to listen to it, right?
I know where you sleep.
Yes, you do. All right. All right, enough of that nonsense. So back to the great souls. I'm going to start with and probably not get into much depth with some really long ago ones, just because they started everything. And and if there's a lot of questions or more interest, we can do longer on them. But so where I'm going to start tonight is with biblically in the Western philosophic traditions based on the Judeo-Christian texts. The humanity started with Adam and Eve, and obviously, probably many people consider that a myth or at least mythologized. Uh, but that's the story of the human origins from the biblical perspective, and also some non-biblical perspectives. Much of the book of Genesis in our Bible, a great deal of it, not only the story of creation, but the story of the flood and a number of key components. We're also in an even earlier, but largely fragmented, what's left of it, Sumerian legends. So very old. This is very old stuff. And Adam and Eve were supposedly the first, two people. And so what I want to start with briefly is just kind of a introduction about aspects of that you may or may not be aware of. Uh, So first of all, without getting into any depth with this, if we want to really do any depth of any of these things that I'm talking about in this series, then we can do a series just on that to have more time. But um, in the book of Genesis, there are two creation stories. The first chapter is one creation story. The second chapter is a completely different creation story. And scholars and people of faith have tried to kind of figure out why the differences and how to merge them and make them into one story. But if you just read them as is, without a lot of fancy interpretation, they're clearly two different stories. Things are made in a completely different order. Um, in the first story, the common or traditional interpretation, which I disagree with, but the common interpretation that you'll read in most English translations is that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Um, and the word God there, the Hebrew word is Elohim. So Hebrew has a number of different words for God, one of which is Elohim, which is a plural masculine word. And so literally the gods created it, but often in Hebrew, that word, which is plural, is used with a singular verb tense. So it's used both ways in Scripture as a plural form and also as a singular form, even though the noun itself is always Elohim, which is a plural form. So anyway, the in the first version, Elohim creates everything. And the very last thing that is created is man. And it's not the man Adam, and it's not man masculine sex or male sex, masculine gender. It's not that. It is a collective word that means mankind or humankind or human beings. So it's not a singular person that's talked about, and it's not a name. It's a category of being, human beings or mankind, that the gods or Elohim creates. Now, there's a different word used for God in the scriptures, which is Yod He Vav He. We've talked about that quite a bit in other programs. So if you don't know about that and want to ask me, email me or text me, or just look it up. There's lots of information. In Greek, it's called the Tetragrammaton. It consists of 4 Hebrew letters, Yod, He, and Vav, He. And it's not a name, and it actually doesn't, as it stands like that, doesn't mean anything because there are no vowels, and you can't really pronounce it. It doesn't, it doesn't have a pronunciation. That was considered the highest reference to God in ancient Hebrew times, that referred to the unnameable, unspeakable, unknowable, unutterable, beyond comprehension, vast, pure beingness of that which is the ultimate reality. We don't have any words that fit it, so call it what you want. That's what that represented. Elohim did not represent that in Hebrew scriptures. It did not represent that. This is the Yod He Vav He is a much, much more expansive concept than Elohim is. So in the second creation story, mankind is created before many of the other things, like the plants and animals and so on. And the the creator of mankind is not the Elohim, it's Yod He Vav He. So there's major differences in this story. And the man that we call Adam, actually in Hebrew is referred to as Ha-Adam. It was, again, not a name. His name was not Adam. Ha means the. It's the article the. So Ha-Adam actually means the man. And you may or may not know this also, but in the second creation story, it's Genesis 2, where that's where it says God created man. The word there again is Ha-Adam, created the man out of the dust of the earth and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living soul. That's why it's usually translated, or something close to that. Not exactly what it says in Hebrew, but that's kind of a standard translation of it. And so, again, here we're created it's a physical form that's being talked about, out of the earth. And the word for the, not the planet Earth, but the word for like dirt or earth or dust, if you want, or dirt, that word that basically means like earth you would hold in your hand, that word is Adamah in Hebrew. So the man made out of that, made out of Adamah, is called Adam. So you can kind of see in Hebrew how all that sort of fits together, which is totally missed in English if you only know the English translations. And then the woman is called Eve, but again, that's anglicized. That wasn't her name. Her name in Hebrew is Chava, and it's basically understood to mean the mother of life or the mother of all living things. Because then from that point on in the story, all human life, some people, of course, take it literally if you're a fundamentalist, but otherwise it's taken symbolically or metaphorically. But the point is, at some point there was this beginning, and there was this male and female human being, and then other human life evolved from that. So that's basically chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve. And briefly, as you go on, everything's great. They live in this paradisical garden called Eden, and everything's wonderful. They don't have to plant or harvest or sow or reap. They everything's just provided. It grows on the trees, it grows on the ground, and they eat only growing natural things. They do not kill animals. They don't eat animals. The animals in the garden at that time also do not eat each other. Everything in Genesis 2 is vegetarian, including the animals. There is no violence that we know of. The uh, the man and woman understand each other and get along. They understand the animals and get along and are not frightened of them because the animals don't eat them either. And they, according to the text, see and hear and walk with God every day. So it's a paradisical state that's being described. And by the third chapter of Genesis, that all falls apart. And there's a serpent introduced, Nachash, and it's not actually a snake, but you can consider it a snake, I guess. And it's never called Satan at this point in the scriptures. It's just called the serpent. And that serpent tempts Eve to do something God asked them not to do, which was partake of fruit from the tree of good knowledge of good and evil. It also never says what that fruit is, traditionally represented as an apple, but unlikely, given where all this took place. But we don't know what the fruit was. But they were to not to eat of it, and they did. Uh, the serpent tempted Eve, she ate of it, then she tempted her husband, and he ate of it. Then everything fell apart. Then their relationship with God fell apart. Then they began to perceive duality. Then they began to be afraid of death. Then they began to not be able to understand animals. All kinds of things happened. And eventually they're expelled from the garden. And so the relationship they had with God is now different. And the relationship they have with creation is different. And the relationship they have with each other is different. And now death comes into the picture and struggle comes into the picture. And um, everything gets harder after that story. And so that's kind of the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible. And then from then on, the Christians of then early, not the real early Christians who were Jews, but the later Christians and today's Christians, a traditional Protestant and Catholic both way of looking at it is that from that point on, all mankind is born in sin because Adam and Eve sinned against God by disobeying. And so, since we're all born of that seed, we all are born in original sin and therefore unworthy of God and therefore unworthy of heaven. And we are worthy of death and punishment. And from the Christian perspective, the only thing that saves us from that is belief in Jesus, who is God incarnate or the Son of God incarnate, and who comes with the mission of saving all of us who are doomed to hell because we're born in sin. And our belief in him is our redemption. And that's kind of the whole mainstream Christian message, very simplified, of course. And Jews did not agree with that. Many other people, of course, who aren't Christians don't agree with that either. And today, there are a number of Christians I know personally who don't subscribe to that theology either, but they still consider themselves Christian and find a lot of meaningful aspects to Christianity and so on. But that's kind of the story of Adam and Eve, is the beginning of all that. So what I want to say is that there's not much more about them. We have some description of their children and grandchildren, and they have Cain and Abel, and then there's the first murder of Cain killing Abel, and so on. And so again, a lot of downhill movement from that point on. But outside the Bible, there are very ancient texts that tell much more about the life of Adam and Eve in much greater detail that we do not have in the Bible, Jewish or Christian Bibles. And there are two sources of that I want to mention. One is actually a real historical source. It exists. You can get it. It's been found and translated, and it's called the Book of Enoch. It's in several sections, and you can get those or even look them up online. Do not, if you want to look them up, confuse it with something called the Keys of Enoch, which is a New Age channeled book that has absolutely nothing to do with what I'm talking about. It sort of pretends to, but it doesn't. And so that's not what I'm talking about. There is something called the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch has been found, has been translated, is available. And it tells a great deal about the life of Adam and Eve and much greater detail about so what happened to them after their exile from the garden. Then what? Goes into a lot of detail about their life. It also goes into much more explanation. There's a weird passage in the book of Genesis about something called Nephilim. And it says, in those days, the Nephilim walked the earth, and they lusted after women and had sex with human women, and their offspring were the race of giants. And it's literally like maybe two or three sentences at most. That's it. No, no, nothing leading up to who these people are, or creatures or beings are, or what the race of giants was, or how long it existed, or what it did, or what became it. Nothing. But in the Bible, nothing. But it's in there. It's very curious, and people have wondered about that for centuries. So there's more explanation about that in this book of Enoch also. And and it's a very esoteric book. There's a lot of symbolic and unusual references to it. There's a lot of mystical concepts to it. Uh, and it's not part of traditional Judaism or Christianity. However, and this is a big however, we now know historically that in the time of Jesus, in the second, what's called the Second Temple period, that in that time frame, among the Essene order, which we've talked about before, and among the followers of Jesus, his apostles and big circle of followers and family, among them, the Book of Enoch was an extremely popular book. It was quoted all the time. It was very well known. And the Essene order in particular, and the Way, which was the name of what the people followed Jesus were called, they were either called Nazarenes or followers of the Way initially, way before they were called Christian, while they were still all Jews. And they revered the Book of Enoch. There's actually, now that it has been found and scholars know what it is and have translated it, there's actually a quote in our Bible, in the letter from Jude in the New Testament. The Book of Enoch is quoted there. So very popular work back then that Christians now know nothing about. And frankly, most Jews, I'm guessing, probably don't either. That could be wrong, but the Jews I know, um, with a few exceptions of the kind of more renewal age Judaism, most of them don't know about it either. Then there's another book that may or may not be historically real. There's an oral legend, a very, very old oral legend, that there was something called the Book of Adam, and it's sometimes also called the Book of Raziel. Raziel is an angel in Hebrew angelology, if that's the right word. And the name basically means the secret of God. El is a God. So Raziel is the secret of God. The This book, the Book of Raziel or the Book of Adam, the story is, but there's never been a historical find of this book. There's been letters referring to it, but never the text. Supposedly, once Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden, God, the creator God, wanted to provide a way for them to come back, a path of return called teshuvah in Judaism, or in Hebrew rather, talked about in Judaism. And this path of teshuvah or path of return, God wanted Adam and Eve to know how to come back to the garden, how to begin to live in that state of consciousness again, and in that same quality of relationship. And so the book of Adam was created by God, and it was a teaching on how to come back into right relationship with God again, how to be redeemed, how to make the return journey, this teshuvah, to come back home to God. And he sent the angel Raziel, the secret of God, with this book to give it to Adam. And so Adam and his descendants began studying it. And from that point on, in Hebrew oral tradition, that book is passed down from great master to great master, but never revealed to the public. And there are stories of different people having it, perhaps Solomon, for example, and much of the magic and remarkable things that he was said to have done were a result of him knowing the secrets of this book. Um, that some of the great Merkaba mystics that did the chariot practices in ancient Judaism had this book and learned many of those inner ascending through the tree of life practices through this book. And the most recent one that I personally am aware of was the Baal Shem Tov, who lived in the late 1700s in Eastern Europe. He claimed to and was said to have had a copy of this Book of Adam. Where it went after that, I have lost track of. And like I said, there have been letters about people who had it and letters about stories of somebody that someone thought had it, but no archaeologist or historian has ever found such a book yet. And maybe it's out there, maybe it's not, or maybe it's another worldly text, or maybe it's all mythology. But it's a very old story. So, and it has a lot of detail in it that we don't have. And then that leads me to the last book reference. There's something in the Kabbalistic writings of Judaism that's called the Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer as the word means book. Yetzirah means formation. So it's called the Book of Formation. And it's a book that supposedly, which leads us to our next two people I'll mention tonight, was written by Abraham. So again, long time ago. And what he came to understand about how creation came into being and how creation is structured, which is what a much later philosopher, Pythagoras, was trying to understand too. We'll get to him in the series. But how did it come into form, the Book of Formation, and how is that form structured? And so that's what that book is about. And again, very cryptic in many ways. A lot of numerology in it, a lot of letters, reference to various Hebrew letters and the power of the sound of those letters. But an intriguing book if it doesn't make you crazy trying to figure it out. So anyway, that's kind of Adam and Eve, and you can learn more about their story in the Book of Enoch, which is available. And the so after that's about 6,000 BC, if we're placing it in chronological calendar time, and then around 4,000 BC is the Abraham Sarah era. Sarah era, that's kind of funny. So their story is told also in the book of Genesis later on, and so that has a lot of famous stories in it. They're giving birth to children, and these two, and they're the almost sacrifice of one of their sons, Isaac, and then how there was another son that was really firstborn but didn't deserve to have the inheritance, and so he was cheated out of that. There's a lot of cheating and misdirection and stuff going on in this lineage, and so there's a number of stories about that. There's stories about then Jacob, whose name eventually changes to Israel, who gives birth to the people of Israel, although it wasn't a nation yet. And then the brother Ishmael, who was born of the slave woman and giving line to the birth of what became the Arab cultures. And there's a lot about Ishmael and Israel, or formerly Jacob, in this whole sequence with Abraham and Sarah. So again, another really important set of components because it gave birth to the two largest groups of Semitic people in the Mideast, which frankly, between the Arab and Jewish cultures, are the entire foundation of the Western culture in almost every way, philosophically, theologically, civilization-wise, civil codes, legal codes, moral codes, and so on. Hugely influential. Not there weren't any other influences, but hugely influential. And all that started then. Now, both with the Adam and Eve story, and then with the Abraham and Sarah story, there's so much of that in the Bible that's already readily available. You can read, and so many commentaries and Bible scholars you can read interpreting and talking about those things. I'm not going to get into that, but I just want to reference them and acknowledge them because they led to so many other things. And if you're interested, again, feel free to look it up. There's a lot of resources. If anybody really, really, really wants us to do a more in-depth series on either Adam and Eve and or Abraham and Sarah and their progeny, we can certainly do that. If you don't already know, in Judaism, the Torah itself is divided up into portions, I'll say in English, and there's an assigned portion you study every week throughout the entire year. If you don't know that, that's easy to find online. And if you just even go through a year of that, following those portions and studying them, you're going to learn a tremendous amount about Abraham and Sarah and the foundation of the lineages that they started and what those became and a lot of the history of that. So, which then led to the nation of Israel eventually, and to, King Saul and King David and King Solomon and all the different things a little further down the road, but still way before Jesus' time. So I'm going to pause there, and if I can get to an Egyptian phase tonight, I'm going to do that, but I want to stop talking. And if anybody has any questions or comments or things you want to put in before I get to Egypt, which is a big, big, big leap further than where we are, let's take time to do that. So anybody have anything you'd like to share or ask before we move to the next phase? Tea break. Thank you to my lovely wife who brought me warm tea, hot tea, actually. Okay, so moving on. I'm going to jump ahead to Egypt because there was a really key thing that happened spiritually key thing that happened in Egypt. And for many, many, many centuries. And the time period I'm going to talk about is Lance, I just saw your mic open. Did you have something you want to say, bro?
Yeah. Hey, who wrote the Book of Enoch?
Supposedly the prophet Enoch. The in the Bible, there are a number of people who are mentioned as key figures, some of whom never die. They're just taken by God, is the way it's put. In some cases, it's phrased, and they walked with God. But there's no death reported at all. Enoch is one of those. And again, in the book of Genesis. And this who's now considered a great prophet, Enoch, wrote this book. And the book is, again, in many sections, but the main content of the book, Enoch describes a process of his soul making an ascent beyond physical consciousness and into higher realms of reality, into what's called the heavenly mansions or the heavenly palaces. Jesus mentions
Other people
in
see
the New
their
Testament
hand.
also. And the it's very descriptive of what he sees in all these different dimensions. So the Book of Enoch is considered to have been written by that Enoch. So
Gotcha. All right, thank you.
yeah, thank you. So I don't know who is up there first, but I saw Anna first and then Ted, so we'll go in that order. If I have it backwards, sorry. Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, you piqued my interest on the giants that were talked about in the Book of Enoch.
Yeah.
Just to explain a little bit about who they were and what that whole little thing was about.
Yeah, very little actually, because I know very little about it. Um, the the basic idea is that there was a certain class of angelic beings, and these angelic beings began to fixate on human experience, which they couldn't have, and they found human women very appealing in a lustful sense. And so they figured out a way to have sex with human women. And then these which they were forbidden to do, but they did anyway. So they were part of the fallen angel
Mhm.
hierarchy. And um, and then these women became pregnant with them. And because the energy field of these angelic beings was so big and so powerful, when they were birthed into human form through the human women, they were giant, like 8 to 9 feet tall. Not like hundreds of feet tall, but like 8 to 9 feet tall. And
Nice for the.
sorry? Oh, I heard somebody say
Oh,
something. Okay.
sorry.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah. I just heard somebody say something. But and they were very destructive. They were very violent toward each other, toward human beings, toward animals, toward everything. They were kind of a deranged, very violent race. And exactly how they were killed out or where they went to, there, even in the book, there's not a clear storyline on that. So there's not much known about them. But there is an oral tradition that some of their seed survived, if you will. And if you've ever heard about the bad seed, they made a
Mhm.
movie even years ago about the bad seed. Uh, the the idea is that some people even today are not fully human when they're born, that they have this other partial genetic component that tends to make them hyper violent and hyper aggressive. So, for what that's worth, and that's not much, I know, but that's kind of all I know about it.
And it was considered all a myth, or are there some
It was not
historical?
considered a myth in the beginning. It was considered history in the beginning.
Okay.
Now it's considered myth because most of us don't believe in that sort of thing. But it was written as if it were an accounting of what happened, historically.
Okay. Very
Yeah.
interesting. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. If you find out more about it, let me know because I not something I've studied in depth, but that's about pretty much what I found in the book. So, all right, Ted, Eunice,
Well, it's Eunice
hello.
who just got making the little comment to Ted about how much these women must have appreciated giving birth to giants.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No kidding. Doesn't say how many women died in the process. I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, all that good stuff. But the thing I had in mind when I raised my hand was somebody somewhere pointed out how uh, most of these, or all of these, Old Testament families
Hmm.
were not uh, well, they don't exactly show good instruction or good examples on family life, but they're also incredibly dysfunctional.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we start with Cain and Abel, even Jacob, and
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, truthfully, while there's a lot of heroic things in both the Old and New Testaments of the Christian Bible, the reality of all that is, and in particular in the Jewish Bible, in the older early eras, very early eras, there was a lot of incest and a lot of lying and a lot of deception and a lot of men saving themselves by giving their wives to whoever wanted them, and so that those people wouldn't hurt the men. Um,
throwing
there's,
Joseph
there's,
into a well and telling his father that he had been killed by a
yeah,
wild animal.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah, and granddaughters
it,
sleeping with their grandfather, and and lots of stuff that would not be the moral standards we would hope our children would adhere to. Yeah,
it, yeah, not to be found in the library of how to have a better life or a
right,
better family.
right.
Not going to find it at the counseling.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know, I know. And this
But
is an interesting, a different point, but an interesting point related to that. If you read, for example, the Christian versions of Jesus, if you only read about Jesus in the New Testament, you get a certain picture of him. There's lots of stuff outside the New Testament about him, but if you only read the New Testament version of Jesus, um, everything is pristine. He's flawless. He's sinless. He never makes a mistake. Um, his mother is pure. If you believe the Catholic Bible and read their version of the Bible, she's even a perpetual virgin, not just a virgin at birth, but perpetually the rest of her life a virgin. Um, Everything is as tidy as you would want your hero to be. And if you read many Eastern traditions, same thing. The heroes are all kind of glorified, exaggerated, whitewashed. Everything is like hunky-dory perfect about them. And much is the same in certain other mythologies as well. But Judaism, one of its unique features is that when you read about Jewish heroes, they're clearly very flawed, almost all of them. And they don't hide that. They tell you King David is one of the greatest kings ever. And they tell you about all the great things he did of uniting the two kingdoms, about all his prowess as a warrior, about all his wisdom, about all his dedication to God and to building the temple, about all these wonderful things that he does. And they tell you, and he lusted after a woman who was not his wife, but was the wife of another man, and then arranged to have her husband killed so he could sleep with her. So that's not okay. But they don't hide that. They don't like cover it up or pretend it didn't happen or make excuses for it. And then he's tormented by that for years and years and years and tries to find forgiveness for that for years and years, which is another important aspect. So, as far as our humanity and how often we make mistakes and violate our own moral standards or internal codes or whatever you want to call them, it's very hopeful because if somebody like that can do something wonderful with their life in service to God, then maybe I can too. And so that's kind of there. I'm not saying there are no other traditions like that, but among major world religious traditions, that's a fairly unique thing within Jewish scripture that you don't find in most others. But yeah, certainly. And in terms of violence also, I mean, my God, the Bible is full of violence. It's even though we think of it being kind of a non-violent thing, it has lots of violence in it. Um, so it doesn't. I'm not saying it's condoning that violence or that it's advocating that kind of violence, but it certainly records that kind of violence. And so, and even Jesus, which we won't get into now, but and maybe we will do this at some point, and maybe we won't. Probably we won't because it's not something people want to know about. But honestly, if you really read what's there about Jesus, and especially if you read some of the other historical and non-canonical but contemporary sources about him, um, he was not the warm, fuzzy, peace at all costs person he's presented to be. And there are really I mean, it's really clear when you take a look at that. I don't mean he was a violent person, but the idea that again, peace at all costs and let people do whatever they want to you. Uh, that actually was not him. So anyway, Nahama and Shuli.
Um, it was me.
Hello.
I was glad you mentioned that the people in the Torah or
Mm,
the Jewish Bible
yeah,
aren't perfect
yeah,
because it gives us something. I'm not perfect, yet I can get better,
exactly.
can improve, and I can do this, I can do that. I just gave a talk on Saturday morning about the counting of the Omer and how it was a 7-week process
Yep.
of going through examining ourselves so we can be better than we were when we started so we could receive the Torah again.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so it's an ongoing thing. And one of the things I said is, we're not perfect. I don't know anybody who's perfect.
No. I
Yet
know a
if
few
we,
people who think they are, but I don't know anybody who is.
and most of the people I've met that think they are aren't.
Right. Exactly. It's a
But
pretty good sign right there. Yeah. Yeah.
but it can encourage us and give us a kind of hope, a kind of
Mhm.
support in becoming better.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I was glad you brought that out, and I just wanted to reemphasize that because I think it's really important
Thank you.
that there's hope for everybody.
Yeah, I think it's important as well. Another thing I didn't mention that's related that I also have always really liked, when the prophets uh, Samuel was looking for a new king, because Saul had gone crazy, basically. I'm summarizing, of course. He was looking at all kinds of people, and everybody was presenting their sons to him. This son's really strong. This son's really smart. This son's really, and these are the guys you should choose. And then he asked about, is this all your sons? And this one guy, well, I have David, but David is kind of a dolt, and he's out there with the sheep, and he's a nobody. He's, he's not the stuff you're looking for, believe me. And that's the one God chose.
Mhm.
And to me, that's another great story, because what God sees in us is often something we can't see in ourselves or we can't see in someone else. And 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 yet they do astonishing things that we would have never guessed. Or we can do astonishing things we would have never guessed. So
We can be inspired in ways that we never dreamed of
yeah,
being inspired.
yeah, exactly.
Ever think you'd be publishing a book?
Yeah, no, I did not actually. I did not.
There you
So,
go. And
very-
it's awesome stuff in it. So,
yeah. Anyway, thank you. I appreciate that, Nahama.
thank you.
Yeah. All righty. Anybody else? All right. So, um, moving ahead, there were two, from a spiritual perspective, there's lots of important historical stuff that happens in every century and every decade. Um, but spiritually transformative things are more rare. And there were two really big ones, that grew out of Egypt that I want to mention. And again, because we're talking so long ago, scholars still argue about when they occurred. Um, One of the big things was, the Exodus, as reported in the Bible. Moses leading the Hebrew people, from slavery, over 400 years of slavery in Egypt, into the Promised Land and into freedom, and that whole journey and what that was all about. Scholars disagree dramatically on when that was, and basically, most of those scholars fall into two camps. Either the Exodus occurred in the 1500s, which was the kind of old historical view of most scholars, that it took place and we're talking BC, of course, in the 1500 BC, which would have actually, that's when many people believed it happened. The pharaoh back then would have been, Ahmose the first, I think, maybe second. More scholars now, biblical scholars and historians, more of them now think it was much later, and that it probably occurred in the 1300s to 1200 BCs, which would have placed it in the reign of Ramses II, who was the great builder of all these huge temples in Egypt, almost all of which had his face or body on them somewhere. And so right now, probably the general majority believe that Exodus took place in 1290 BC. So did it or didn't it? I don't know. But that relates to another date that also people are not sure about, and that is the reign of Akhenaten and Nefertiti in Egypt. So I'm going to talk about them first, because there's a huge parallel between them and Moses that I haven't heard too many people talk about. So let me tell you briefly about them. Akhenaten, which means basically one who serves Aten. He became Pharaoh of Egypt along with his queen Nefertiti. Tremendous changes happened in Egypt during that time and in understanding things. Prior to that time, all the Egyptian dynasties worshipped a multiple pantheon of gods and goddesses. The primary one of which was Amun, and sometimes called Amun-Ra. And the priesthood of Amun-Ra, this gets very involved. And if you like, I will also talk about how there are throughout history not only trends spiritually, but there are groups of souls that keep re-embodying and to try to complete a particular work in the world. And this particular group around Akhenaten came in at a time when the Amun-Ra priesthood was really big. The Amun-Ra priesthood was very corrupt in many, many ways, very power hungry, and misused and misled the people a lot. Let's just put it that way. When Akhenaten became Pharaoh of Egypt, he radically transformed Egyptian worship. I mean, not a little bit, totally. He threw it all out. He said, all of this is nonsense. It's all not true. All the gods you're worshiping are not real. Don't do this. For those of you familiar with the story of Abraham and leaving all his idols behind and going to the new land to worship the one God, does that sound familiar? Yes, it does. And he said, there's only one God, and his name is Aten. And his symbol was the sun. He was the sun god. And the point of that was not that he believed the sun was God, but that God was light. God was the light of consciousness. And so the sun was the best representative he could think of, especially in a hot desert region, to say this is what provides the light and the warmth and life for everything. That's the one light of God, the one light of consciousness. And that's the only thing worth worshiping. So he moved the capital of Egypt from Thebes to Tel El Amarna, which is a very different area of Egypt, put it out kind of in the middle of the desert, built a temple there to Aten, and he did something else that no pharaoh before him had done or after him had done, and that was pharaohs were always depicted, whether there's a male or female pharaoh, because they had both, and sometimes they had brother or sister or father-daughter pharaohs who both reigned together. Pharaohs were always depicted in a divine representation. They were in communion with God. They wore the headdress of the raised serpent or the crown. They talked to the god Horus. They were communicating with gods. They were part of the gods. They were seen doing initiation ceremonies with their candidates. They're always depicted in those kind of ways. They are never, ever depicted with family or doing anything domestic, ever. But when Akhenaten came, all of the things, all of the paintings, all of the hieroglyphs, all the monuments that were constructed during his period showed Nefertiti nursing their babies, showed he and Nefertiti hugging each other, showed them having dinner together, showed them taking walks together, showed them doing loving domestic family things together. Never happened before. And so there was a tremendous surge of worshiping a God that was formless, which is also what Abraham did, and worshiping a God that was ever present and available to everyone, not just the elect and not just the people of that particular tribe or region, which is also what Abraham did. And they had a tremendous following for a while, and it was a very happy and prosperous time for a very short while. And then the Amun-Ra priesthood, who had lost their influence and power, found very devious and subtle ways and treacherous ways to actually have Akhenaten killed. And so when he died, there's still a question of whether he was murdered or not, but I personally am convinced he was. When he was murdered, then Nefertiti would have taken over the reins, and they tried to kill her too. So she fled the country. And at that point, she leaves Egyptian history. But she reappears in another history later, which is, believe it or not, in Peru, South America, at Lake Titicaca. And archaeologists have now found an Egyptian remnants, Egyptian pottery, Egyptian writings at Lake Titicaca, which they have no explanation for why they're there. But the oral legend was she fled there with some protectors and lived out the rest of her life there. Once the Akhenaten priesthood was kind of obliterated and overcome, the Amun-Ra priesthood took over again. They ruined Tel El Amarna. They literally went to every pictograph, every stele, everything they could find that had anything of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, their family on it, and literally scratched them all out. So there's almost none left that you can see anymore. You can read about them in ancient documents when they existed, but you can't, there's hardly any you can see anymore. And they destroyed all the literature they could find, and they went back to the worship of multiple gods and goddesses again. So it was a gigantic change. So I'll wrap up with this part, which will lead us, we'll do a little bit more of this next week, and I want to tie it into the Abrahamic faith and Moses because it's really, really similar, but it's Egyptian. When we pick up the story of Moses, long after this, when the Hebrews are enslaved and he's rescued from the river and raised as the son of Pharaoh and so on, where did he get the idea of one God? Because it wasn't Egyptian. Where did he get the idea of this moral code that he has? Because that was not Egyptian either at the time. There are some scholars that actually believe the reign of Akhenaten is not when we think it was either, nor was the Exodus, and that Akhenaten is the Pharaoh that rescued Moses, and he was raised in Akhenaten's house before the Amun-Ra uprising, before Akhenaten was killed, and that's where he got exposed to all these ideas. And then the next Pharaoh enslaved all those people, but not Moses, because he was part of the royal house at that time, so he was still allowed to live in that house. That's why he was so incensed when the Hebrew people were treated so badly and spurred him on to move them toward liberation. That's a very kind of out there historian theory now. Most don't subscribe to it, but it is an interesting one. But in any case, so here are the essentials of what Akhenaten taught as far as spiritually, that there is only one supreme creator and God, and that light is its essence, and that the sun is its symbol. That all other gods and goddesses are not real, they're mankind's fantasy, and they should not be worshipped. That this one God, Atan, was the universal creator, and that therefore all people of all places, all times, all religions, all faiths, all races were his children, and they should all be treated as brothers and sisters. He said that the most important way to express your devotion to Atan was through a loving family, and that family was the core of why we were here and the work we were to do here, and that family was the way God was demonstrated and embodied in the life of human beings. And he taught that the culture needed to be reshaped around understanding the reality of this oneness of God. And that when you have a culture that's fragmented and broken and worshiping all these multiple different things and don't know the truth, the culture will always suffer. That the only way to end cultural suffering was to bring them to the realization of this one one light, one essence of being in which we all partake. So to some of us, that's probably going to sound pretty familiar, but it was very unfamiliar to Egypt at that time and really, really resisted very strongly, especially by people already in power. So the very last piece is this. If you take that idea and move it into the time of Yeshua, when he's talking about one God and everybody being children and treating everybody with loving kindness and forgiving everybody and practicing that love, guess what? Not all of, but some of the people in power, in spiritual positions of authority in his time, who also, not that they all were, but many of them also were corrupt and enhancing their own power at the expense of their people. They took they had great resistance and hostility toward him. And so that theme plays out a lot in human history, even as far back as this. But this is a very early beginning of establishing a lineage of the worship of one God and a core. Judaism talks about something called the remnant that will be left, the branch of David or the root of Jesse and all of that, that will be left, that will restore things. There is a remnant from Akhenaten on of this kind of underground movement that then surges up and then gets squashed down and then stays underground and then surges up again. So I'm hoping to kind of tie that in a little bit to the Moses thing next week, but we're out of time. So, and I hope you find some of this interesting, or if you really don't, let me know and we can shorten up the series a little bit. But I want to touch on some of these thematic things and the people that brought them forward and try to get through some of the souls that I mentioned in the first couple of classes, first class. At least kind of expose you to some of those. So that's where we'll stop tonight. And if you have questions about Akhenaten and Nefertiti, we can do more of that next week. And then hopefully we'll move a little bit more into Moses and Aaron and that era and what they were doing and how that related to Pharaoh also, because Moses was not just a Hebrew. He was born a Hebrew, but he was raised in the royal house of Egypt as son of a pharaoh. So literally would have been grandson. But how does all that interface with one another, and what happens to Egypt after their rejection of Moses, and what happens that then starts this whole lineage of what became Judaism and then eventually became the nation and people of Israel and so on. So anyway, okay, that's that. If you're interested in the Nefertiti legend about Lake Titicaca, which is the largest lake in Peru, maybe one of the largest lakes in the world, I think. I might be wrong about that, but it's huge and very deep. Also, curiously enough, a place where there have been a tremendous amount of UFO sightings over the years, documented sightings. So that's another interesting thing because there's an oral tradition that, like the Book of Enoch I mentioned, Akhenaten and Nefertiti had a particular method by which they could do an ascent into higher realms of awareness and come back, which kind of ties in with some of the Kabbalistic ideas and stuff as well. So, okay, I have to quit talking. So, thank you all for being here tonight. Let's just take a brief pause, if you would, and kind of come back to quiet inside again. Whatever awareness or interest or resistance may have arisen, just kind of let that all gently fall away and just come back into that quiet space inside where you and God are at a place you can connect with one another. And from that quiet place, just let that peaceful being begin to extend out into your life this week. That more of that dynamic of peace and being can just begin to pervade your world and help inspire those in your world to find that same kind of peace within themselves and begin to bring it forward. So again, thank you so much for your kind attention and presence. I honestly really do appreciate it a lot. And happy birthday to my lovely wife.
Happy birthday, Anita or Ani.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Auntie.
Welcome to the 7th level.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm fully intending on enjoying all my old person privileges from here on out. Blessings on all of you. Bye-bye.
Love you all. Good night.
Bye-bye.